Hi friends, Jenny at Clover and Violet here, and today I'm going to be showing you how you can add a little dowel to the back of your mini quilt for hanging. So here's the front of this quilt, and then on the back I've added these little pockets and a dowel from my local hardware store, and that allows me to hang my quilt on the wall with just a simple push pin, no punching through the fabric, and your quilt will look stunning wherever you want to hang it. So let's gather some scraps, your mini quilt before you've put the binding on, and we'll get these little hanging corners sewn on your quilt. Let's get started. Okay, today I'm going to be finishing this spools mini quilt. So I've already sewn my quilt top, and I've already layered my batting and my backing and quilted it and quilted one line all the way around the edge. So I'm going to show you how I'm going to finish this quilt for hanging. You could make this into a pillow, a big tote bag, whatever you want, but I have a spot on my sewing room wall that currently has a 24-inch quilt on it, and so I'm going to put this 24-inch quilt in that spot. So let me show you first how I hang my mini quilts with a finished quilt. So here's a finished quilt with a binding. And I use just a dowel from the hardware store, and I cut it to size, and then I slip it in these little pockets that I've made. So that's what we're going to make today, is the little pockets. These are super convenient because then you can just take the dowel out and your quilt will hang. This will work for a 24-inch quilt. Anything bigger, you might need another little loop in the middle as well. I like to do just the corners that I can put a thumbtack and then hang my quilt from the middle, but you could use 2 thumbtacks on a different quilt. And so by putting a little loop in the middle, that will cause your quilt not to sag. So we're actually going to add a little loop to the middle of our mini quilt here, just so I can show you how I would do that. So we're going to set this quilt aside and make the hanging corners and the middle. So here's a scrap of fabric that I used for my quilt. Let me grab my ironing board. Here's my mini iron and my little travel ironing board. A lot of people ask me about the ironing board, and a friend actually made this for me, and she doesn't sell them anymore, but I do love it. It has, I'll show you real quick. It has grip and wood on the bottom so that your iron isn't going to heat through, and I can use it safely on my cutting mat. I don't like to just set my iron even on this or on anything else with a wool mat on my cutting mat, because the steam or just the heat of the iron can go through the mat and ruin, through a wool cutting mat, and ruin your surface. So I like to use this board that has wood on it. You could cover a tray tabletop and then remove the legs or something like that as well. But just wanted to answer that question I often get about my mini ironing board. So now we've got this all good to go. I'm going to move this iron out of the way. And then I'm going to cut my fabric to be 2 3-inch squares. And I can't get a second square out of this piece, so I'll set that aside as a scrap, and I'll cut one more 3-inch piece. This fabric I've had around for quite a while, so I'm not exactly saving it well. So we'll cut another 3-inch off of this piece. And then I'm going to use this leftover piece, which is, this is 3 inches by 2 3/4. I'm going to use it for my little center sleeve, and so it doesn't really matter the size. Let me just show you how we're going to iron all those 3 pieces. Grab my ironing board back. So we're going to take our little 3-inch squares and just fold them in half on the diagonal and press really well. Get a little steam action. Okay. All right, there's one. Here's another. All right. And then we'll take this little 3 by 2 3/4 piece, and I'm just going to fold a little more than 1/4 inch on each edge. Do the same on the other edge. All right. And then we will fold this in half. Iron it one final time. And then I am going to run over to my sewing machine and just stitch these 2 long pieces with my piece unfolded. And then we'll fold it again and attach it to our mini quilt. So let's stitch those long pieces and I'll be right back. Okay, now I've stitched this. You can see I just ran 2 little lines of stitching, and that will keep this fabric inside. If it frays a little, I'm not too worried. It's going on the back of a mini quilt that's for hanging, so it's not going to be a piece that gets washed a lot or sees a lot of other kinds of use. So we have our 3 pieces ironed nicely. We'll put our ironing board aside, and then let's grab our mini quilt. Now, I've done this before where I accidentally did my quilt upside down. So let's make sure this one is right side up. Here's our quilt. Let's turn it over so you can see my little fussy cuts. It's right side up. And then we are going to place these pieces. So these corners are just going to go right over the edge, just like this. And they're going to go under the binding. So I'm just going to grab my pins and pin this in place. And then I'm going to do the same with the other side. Pin it in place. And you could make your squares smaller than 3 inches. You could use 2.5 inch mini charms or something like that. I usually just cut 3 so that there's plenty of room for the binding and for the dowel. Now we have our little centerpiece. Almost dropped it there. And now you'll realize if I put this piece right here, it's not really going to help me with the dowel. So let's grab our dowel from our other quilt, and we'll just imagine that the dowel is here, and then move this piece up. Like so. And then I am going to just pin it in place. So it turns out that my piece is about 2 inches. All right, let's actually do 1 3/4. Let's see how this would work. Is that going to fit our dowel? Probably not. Let's stick with 2 inches. This is a bit of experimental sewing for me here. Make sure this is centered. Okay, there we go, center. And the purpose of this piece is not really for hanging. It's just to give your quilt a little something to rest on so that it doesn't buckle forward in the middle, okay? So the purpose of this is not to hold up your quilt. It is just to keep your quilt pushed back on the dowel. So let me show you real quick. Especially when you do a larger quilt. Here's my original mini quilt, and here's the dowel. The quilt can lean forward like this, right? And so the longer the quilt, the more the chance that your quilt is going to lean forward, bulge, or maybe even sag down. Mine don't usually sag, but but maybe it would over time. So all this little loop is going to do is just keep the dowel to the back. All right, keep the quilt to the back. And then we'll pin it and it will hang like this and it won't, it won't have the chance to bulge forward. And since this is a bigger quilt, it's more likely to do that. So now I'm going to take this one more time to the sewing machine and I'm just going to sew at 1/4 inch, 1/4 inch, 1/4 inch on this side, and then we'll trim this middle one and I'll be right back. So we've now sewn all these pieces on our mini quilt. I'm just going to grab my ruler and trim this to be the size of the quilt. Don't need it to be extra. And then we will bind our quilt, and then I'll show you how I put the dowel in this mini quilt. But let's look at this little sleeve real quick. So if we had our dowel, we could slide it in. Maybe. There we go. And then it would slide in here. I know this dowel is too short, but you can see how when the quilt is hanging, now it has another pressure point so that it's not going to bulge out right here in the middle. So that's the purpose of this little additional piece. But we'll get a correct size dowel after we bind this quilt. I'm going to bind it using a double fold binding, but I also love to use a single fold binding on these mini quilts, and you can find both the links to those videos, single fold binding and double fold binding, in the description of this video. So let me go do that binding and then I'll be back to show you the mini quilt. Okay, so here we have our mini quilt with the dowel, and you can see that this just slides in and out of this little pocket. You can just see it sliding in and out, and then your quilt is just going to go in these corners right here. So you're just going to slide it in one and then just slide it in the other, and it's perfect, ready to hang. And so this little extra piece, like I said, is really best for a bigger mini quilt. And you can see that mine actually turned out to be more snug than I thought it was going to be, but it fit my dowel just fine. And so then when I just hang it, I'm just going to use 2 push pins, and then it will hang neatly, and you won't get any of that gapping in the middle that you can get, especially when you hang a larger mini quilt. And this one is 24 inches wide, but I would not add this to a quilt that isn't over like 18 inches. So most of my mini quilts don't have this little extra center, but I was trying to add it so that you could see an option for hanging a little bit bigger quilt on your wall. So I hope you enjoy this video to hang your mini quilts, and I would love to see you subscribe to my newsletter and subscribe to this YouTube channel. You can find both of the links below this video. All right, happy sewing.